Hello, my name is Bob Tribe, and welcome to Valley to Vietnam. Valley to Vietnam is a joint effort between the Sacramento Public Library and the Vietnam Veterans of America Chapter 500. It is our intent to trace the arc of experience between Sacramento and Vietnam for our local Vietnam-era vets. And today, our guest is Norman Hile. Norman, welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Norm was a forward observer with the Americal Division as a first lieutenant and served there in Vietnam in 1970 and 71, I
Correct.
take it. Well, Norm, you were born in New York.
Yes.
But you've lived here in Sacramento for over 30 years.
Yes, came here in 1983.
Okay. And you have kind of this interesting background. You also lived in Venezuela.
Yes, when I was 8 years old, my father was transferred to the interior part of Venezuela for an iron mine that U.S. Steel owned, and we lived in Venezuela for 6 years, between my ages 8 to 14.
Okay. And then at 14 you left to go to school in the States?
Yes, there was no American or English-speaking high school where we were in Venezuela, so I started boarding school at Andover in Massachusetts.
Okay. When you finished school there, you went on to Yale.
Yes, I started at Yale in the fall of 1963,
Okay.
graduated in 1967.
Okay. And your major there was?
Economics.
That's what I thought. And you began law school.
Yes, I started law school at Columbia Law School in New York the fall after I graduated from Yale, and I was in law school at Columbia when the Tet Offensive occurred in January of 1968.
Right.
And at that point, they decided they needed more draftees. That was before the lottery.
Uh-huh.
And the way they were taking people in the draft at that point was oldest up to age 26 who had not yet been drafted. And they announced that as of June, people who were in their first year of graduate school would lose their student deferments. And so I lost my student deferment and made me the oldest person on my draft board who hadn't been drafted yet.
I
was drafted.
I imagine when you showed up after you were drafted, you were probably, most of the people were much younger than
Sure,
you.
they were drafting 18-year-olds.
Sure.
So I was, 23?
Yeah. I was, I think, 22, and I was assigned to a room in Oakland before, I went into the Army, and here were a bunch of these 18-year-olds reading comic books in the room I was supposed to be in. So I went down to the bar, met this guy, and he said, "Hey, I got an empty bunk," and so I went there. But I know the feeling. So you went into the Army not immediately, though. You were drafted in June of '68, but
Yes, they gave me a test to see if I could qualify for officer candidate school, and I passed that, and so they said I could start in September rather than in June because they wanted a place for me in the after I did basic training in AIT at officer candidate school in Fort Sill, Oklahoma for artillery. So I spent that summer with the Yale Glee Club in South America. It's a great summer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
At several locations in South America?
We covered all of Central and South America. We went 8 weeks.
Wow.
We went just about every country in Central and South America.
Do you still sing?
I do.
Oh, nice.
Right.
So where did you go to basic training?
I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Boo.
Right, also known as Fort Lost in the Woods. And that was in the fall of 1968, and it would start off with hot as all get out when we
Right.
first arrived, and it was cold as all get out when we left. But I finished that in probably about November of 1968.
I remember reading in the folks who came west, so many came from Missouri because it was just a big swamp and there was all kinds of malaria and all kinds of diseases. So you're at Fort Leonard Wood for basic, but then you're going to go to AIT elsewhere.
because I was going to artillery OCS, they sent me to AIT in fire direction control at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is the head of the artillery for the U.S. Army. And I did my AIT there, and then started officer candidate school at the Officer Candidate Brigade for artillery a couple of months later.
One thing I didn't ask you when we talked previously was this transition from your life prior to going to the service and then suddenly going, was that pretty drastic for you?
It was culture shock of the worst type. Bear in mind, and this is a historical part to this, in the spring of 1968, when I was finishing my first year in law school, was the spring of the Strawberry Statement and the riots at Columbia and the school being completely taken over by SDS and all of that. I was in law school, and we were seeing all of this revolution going on.
Right.
And then suddenly I was in basic training at Fort Leonard Wood with no constitutional rights at all.
Right.
They could go through my locker and go through my stuff at any time.
Yeah.
And I was in a completely different situation where I couldn't even leave the base for the first, several weeks. And
right.
Yeah, it was culture shock.
Yeah, I found it drastically different, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. So, what was officer candidate school like for you?
It's just like the plebe experience for people at West Point for the first 8 weeks.
Right.
Then you graduate to the middle level and then the senior level. I was fortunate that I was at the top of my class, so I got to be out more than most of the rank and file for weekends and stuff like that. But I learned to shoot artillery, and that's the main job that they were teaching us.
Sure. So then you're going to head for Vietnam in the summer of 1970.
Yes, for the year after I graduated from OCS, when I was a second lieutenant, I was assigned back to the officer candidate school to be an instructor, but my real job was to run the glee club for the officer candidate brigade, because the commanding officer wanted the officer candidate school to be a lot like West Point, and he wanted a glee club. So I, having been a glee club director, was directing the officer candidate brigade glee club.
Well, we did not have a glee club at Fort Benning. We had swimming teams, football teams, track teams, you name it, but no glee club. So you arrive in Vietnam. What were your first impressions?
Well, when I got to Vietnam, I was assigned to a brigade artillery for the Americal Division, which was up in I Corps. And when I was on the helicopter on the way up to where I was going to be assigned, I looked down at what was below us, Highway 1 and all the area, and I said to the pilot, which is the part that we control? And he said, none of it.
Right.
Other than when we are standing on a piece of ground, we don't control any of it. And I realized at that moment that this is mid-1970, that the war had been lost. We were no longer going to win this war, and it was just a matter of staying alive.
And you felt maybe a little bit like Custer.
Absolutely. Well, or as John Kerry said, I think very eloquently, I didn't want to be the last person to die for a mistake.
Right. What was your job like as a forward observer?
Well, as a forward observer in the Vietnam War, instead of being at an outpost, my job was to be part of the infantry company and to shoot and adjust artillery in support of the infantry company. So I was with the command center of the infantry company, which was a captain and a couple of RTOs.
Right.
And my job was to bring in artillery if we were in a firefight. At night, I would shoot defensive targets so that we could protect ourselves when it was dark. And during the day, when we learned where we were going from one point to another with the infantry company, I would bring in artillery on the path we were going to try to blow up all the booby traps that might be between us and where we were going. And so the infantrymen liked me because
that had to make you popular.
I was somebody who could help them quite a bit. If you're walking point, you were going to try to walk in the craters of the artillery shells that I just fired in advance of our march. So I was basically a grunt, but I was, instead of being there to shoot with my M16, my job was to bring in artillery.
Right.
And the other thing I have to say, and this is with all due respect to all you infantrymen out there, the infantry generally doesn't know how to read maps. And as an artilleryman, I had to know how to read a map because I was going to bring in heavy artillery and adjust it in onto a spot where we were or close to us. And so the other real important function that I served was telling them where we were. And when they told us where we're going, figuring out how we were going to get there.
Well, I ended up teaching land navigation, so I know I can read a map, but I knew there were people who were a little shaky, and I thought, if there wasn't a major war going on right now, some of these people in my class probably wouldn't be wearing bars. So, but the people I get together with are a great group of people, and all served well. You mentioned that by this time, in 70-71, this was a war much different than 65, 66, 67. You mentioned the riots back home. Martin Luther King was assassinated. There was a lot of unrest. And you mentioned that you saw, you had situations where NCOs and officers were getting fragged.
Yeah.
So you want to just...
Well, there were a lot of very unhappy, disgruntled people and a lot of people on drugs in Vietnam when I was there. Mm-hmm. Officers were not particularly well liked by the troops, and there were a lot of incidents where officers were either shot in the back or fragged, which was somebody throwing a grenade in their hooch. I was actually not the target, but I actually had a grenade blow up about 20 feet away from me in a hooch when I was flying later, and I was back in a base camp. They were trying to get somebody else. It was a very dangerous situation. When I was in the field, since I was an important element for keeping people alive and supporting them, I didn't feel that I was in any danger from that perspective, because I didn't have to order people to walk point. I didn't have to order people to go on a particular patrol or something like that. My job was to support them when they had to do it.
You mentioned to me that after about 6 weeks, you were seen as an old hand.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, at least from my perspective of the war, that was just so poorly managed. Obviously, when I went over there, I was just put into an infantry company that was already out in the field. I didn't know anybody. I'd never served with any of those people. There was no team sense to it. And that was the way it was, at least up in the area that I was. So you never developed a feeling of team spirit. But as people rotated out after their 1 year, 365 days in Vietnam, new people would come in and replace them who had never met anybody in the company.
Yeah.
We had a lot of casualties in the infantry company that I was in, and so after about 6 weeks, I was one of the old hands as far as the people who had been out in the field and knew what was going on. So it was the people looked to somebody who had been out there for a while, because the young people or the new people who were just coming in had no idea what they were doing. The other thing that I think we talked about that was an experience that I had that I thought was, again, a showing of how the war was mismanaged was in our infantry company, we most of the time had a captain who was the company commander, but we had 4 platoons, each of which, under the way the Army is set up, should have had a lieutenant, an officer, as the platoon leader.
Right. And
we rarely had any lieutenants in the field.
That's amazing.
The most we ever had was 1. And each squad within the platoon should have a non-commissioned officer, an NCO,
Right.
As the head of that squad and doing those things. We never had any NCOs in the field. We had one E6 who was killed shortly after I started. Most of the platoons, which should have been run by lieutenants, or at the worst by a senior NCO,
Right.
were being run by Spec 4s.
Wow.
People who had just been in the Army for, at the most, 10 months.
Yeah. That's amazing. And of course, some of those initial units that came over, like the 1st Cav, the Marines, and like the 4th Infantry Division, I mean, they all trained back in the States. They came over on boats together and had been together for a long time. But I think they never expected the rate of casualties that suddenly popped up. And so then you had to pull all these people out of the field who were seriously wounded or dead. And then you start having all these overlapping kind of tours where the whole situation would change every month.
You know, and the fact of the matter was that you had a 1-year tour, 365 days, and so it wasn't that you were going to be with your unit until the unit was brought back.
Right.
You were going to be there for your 365 days, and then you were getting out of the field, and all the people that you were in the field with were going to be there until their 365 days were over.
Right.
And so there was no sense of unit cohesion or feeling that you were going to rely on the people within your unit. You hear a lot about that in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that people who come back have a real feel of loss, that they don't have the unit that they were so close to and the people they relied upon for their lives.
Right.
And we didn't have any of that. Boy, we were all individuals just stuck into this situation, and we had to try to survive.
And this is repetitive, but you know, most of my friends who I talked to, they were there in '67 and sometimes into '68, and it was a whole different army then, you know. And there wasn't all the negative feelings that pretty soon, you know, you've got the whole country demonstrating against the war, or the most vocal people, and the guys are thinking, why the hell am I here?
Right.
And what are we accomplishing? You know, are we any further ahead than we were, you know, X number of years ago? So,
well, one of the things that really hurt our morale in the field, I'll give an example of this, was we got very low on having the number of people that we needed within the infantry company to do what we're supposed to be doing, and we called and said we do need some reinforcements. We need some new people out here, and they said fine. And a couple of days later, a resupply helicopter arrived, and they had 3 guys on the helicopter who they were kicked off onto the ground, who were supposed to be our replacements. And we quickly found out that all 3 of them were hooked on heroin. They'd been in the rear and they'd been caught using drugs. And what the people in the rear did was they sent them out to the field as punishment.
jeez.
So we were not going to put ourselves in danger by having people who were unreliable and were using drugs, you know, as part of our company, and having to rely upon them at night for pulling guard and all of that. So we put them on the next helicopter back to the rear. Said we
Wow.
we'd rather not have these replacements than have them.
You also mentioned that you had a lot of nice photographs showing you out in open areas and moving across these big plains, and then, of course, going into the hills. That generally your MO was to make a lot of noise.
We, even when we were down a number of people within the infantry company, we were a bigger force than most of certainly the Viet Cong, as well as the NVA. We were in an area where the NVA was also operating. And so we wanted them to know where we were, figuring that they were not going to take on that big a group of infantry. And so we tried to make noise and let them know where we were so that they would stay far away. And then if we sent out patrols, we would try to make sure that they didn't get too far away from us, because we didn't want them to get separated.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just, of course, the infantry. It's your artillery you can call in, and the air you can call in, which
Right.
is pretty devastating. So,
Which they didn't have. That was the
Right.
thing that was so amazing, that they were fighting us Here we had artillery and we had gunships and we had mortars and we had all this stuff, and they were fighting us with RPGs and machine guns. So they had no way to call in any support at all. I was very impressed by how tenacious and smart they were as fighters.
They've been fighting a long time.
Yep.
You know.
Yep.
You just talked about how you would get kind of orders from battalions saying, okay, we want you to move to a certain location, and it's only a couple of kilometers away. And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, this comes back to map reading. We were, particularly in the first 6 months I was in the field, it was very hot. Unbelievably hot and humid, and it was very difficult with all the stuff that we were carrying. Our packs would routinely be 60 pounds or more with the ammunition and everything else that we had. And they would send us a message in the morning that we were to go from point A to point B, and I would take a look at the map, and point B was at a point straight up a mountain from where we were at point A. And we would not only be trying to carry all this stuff, hump it as we called it, uphill in this heat, but we were also very exposed when you're marching up a hill unless you're in the trees. And so we a number of times called back and said, you know, we can't go that far, and we'll be in danger of heat prostration and other things if we do that. And they would say, what do you mean? It's only 500 meters. And we would say, yeah, but it's straight uphill. If you look at your map,
Right.
They'd say, you go there. So we would have to go there.
And you were wounded.
I was.
Yeah.
I was wounded during a battle where we were with some armor at the time, and we woke up one morning when the NVA had shot RPGs into the tanks that we were with to blow them up, and I took a piece of the RPG in my knee, ricocheting off one of the tanks that was hit.
Uh-huh.
And so I was treated in the field. I didn't leave the field, but I'm a Purple Heart recipient as a result.
Okay. And you were a forward observer for 6 months, and then your job changed.
Yes, under the way the brigade artillery worked for the Americal Division, after 6 months, when you had finished 6 months as a forward observer with an infantry company, they sent you back to the rear and you did something else. And in my case, unfortunately, they put me into a light plane, and I flew as an aerial observer for the rest of my tour in a small plane, looked like a small Cessna.
Okay.
OV-1
Sure.
Bird Dog.
So initially you're in a fixed wing aircraft, but that's going to change.
Right. I was in the fixed wing most of the time. I flew, 50 hours times 15. I got 15 air medals for combat flying in OV-1s. But in the middle of my tour, I was the part that I was in an aerial observer. I was in helicopters for about a month.
Did you feel safer in one type of aircraft versus the other? Or?
Well, the OV-1s did not have any armament at all, and all we had with us to carry in it was a .45. So if we got shot down, we were in trouble.
Right.
And we did take fire into the wings, but I preferred that to the helicopter situation. I crash landed twice in helicopters, and they are much more complex machines, and they have much more problems. Sure. And they tend to take fire too because they're not going as fast.
Yeah. So, as an aerial observer, what was your alleged mission here?
I would usually a mission would be a 3-hour flight. I would go out into usually the western part of the AO that we were in, find targets that I could shoot at, whether they be buildings or other things that clearly were belonging to the NVA. but also if somebody from on the ground was in trouble and they needed somebody to spot artillery to help them, I would get called and we would fly over to where they were, and I would spot artillery from the air onto those targets, whatever they might be.
I'd like you to tell again the story you mentioned to me about the day you were flying and you were supposedly supposed to adjust fire on this village.
Yeah, I got a call one day when we were out saying that there was an intelligence target, and they gave me the grid coordinates for this, and they wanted me to adjust the artillery onto it. That meant when the first rounds came out, I would then move them to the right spot. So we flew out to the coordinates that they said, and I looked down on the ground, and it was a small village, and there were a lot of women and children and animals, farm animals and stuff like that, running around, just part of village life there. So I called back to the people who had asked me to go out and adjust the artillery onto this target, and I said, I see women and children. I don't see any enemy combatants. I don't think that we can fire onto this. And I got a call back saying, yes, we are going to fire on it. Please adjust. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to adjust onto women and children. And they said they're going to fire anyway. So they fired one round that went very close and obviously killed some people. The village chief, I learned later, called immediately back and said, what are you doing firing on my village? And the fire mission was canceled. I thought that was the end of it. But a couple of days later, I was told that I was to appear for a hearing that would be the first part of a court-martial. And I said, well, what are the charges? And they said that there had been people killed by the one round that had come out, and that I was being court-martialed because I had told them they could go ahead and fire.
Hopefully you had some evidence that you did not say that.
Right. Fortunately and obviously, the pilot in the plane who was listening to me on the radio said, no, that's not what happened. And also the radio operator at the division, who had been the person who was communicating back and forth, said, no, he didn't say that. He said, don't fire. So I was not court-martialed, but that sort of shows that the delicate balance that we were in at all times with what I was doing, which was, in that situation, I actually refused a direct order to adjust artillery, and if I had done so, I probably would have been court-martialed because I would have killed a lot of people. But they wanted to court-martial me for saying the wrong thing.
And my guess is the senior officer who gave that order, probably nothing happened.
I'm sure nothing happened.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about previously was the racism that you observed in the military. And I think any of us who maybe grew up in places like the far north or the far west saw something different when we just went in the service. But what were some of the sort of things that you experienced?
Well, when I was in basic training, at the end of the cycle for basic training, you get your orders, which tell you what your MOS is going to be, what your military occupational specialty is going to be. And of course, when my basic training company got those orders out in a formation at the end of our cycle, it was stark that all of the African American trainees were infantry riflemen. They were going to be the ones who were going to Vietnam and get shot at. And all of the white guys in our company were truck drivers, cooks, accountants, secretaries, stuff like that. It was so obvious that it was very difficult for us to get through the rest of the day because all of the black guys in our company were so angry that it was just so obvious. Another example of it was when I got to the field in Vietnam with the infantry company that I was with, I would say at least 70 to 80% of the people out in the field were people of color. It was just startling to see that the people who were actually out there were the riflemen, like the people in my infantry, in my basic training company. And then another particularly poignant example of it, I think, is what happened when I got a new radio telephone operator, RTO, after I'd been out in the field for a little while. The helicopter resupplying us landed, and here was my new RTO, and I went up to him, and he was a black guy from Texas, and he wouldn't talk to me. And we spent the next couple of days he just, if I said something to him, he would do it, but he was not going to talk to me. And finally, after about a week, I said to him, what's the matter? What's going on? What's the problem? And he said, when he arrived at the fire base back where the guns are, with two other new people, two white guys and himself.
RTOs.
They were going to be on the guns,
okay.
Shooting on the guns. The artillery battery commander looked at the three of them, and he said to the two white guys, "You're on the guns here," and to me, the black guy, "You're out in the field getting his ass shot." So it was startling that that's the way things worked. So those are just my impression of how the thing was going was so stark that if you were a person of color or African American, you were much more likely to be sent out into a very dangerous situation. When I finished my tour in the field and was sent back to be an aerial observer, I was able to convince the people in the rear that the best radio telephone operator that they had was my guy in the field. Bring him back into the rear, because he knows how to do this, and he's been out in the field, and he knows how it works in the field for the people who are actually calling in the artillery. And so they did. So he
could talk to all these guys out there.
Right. So they brought him in.
Oh, that's good. Okay, you're going to finish your tour, and you're going to head home, but you had an incident on the plane where you headed home that was kind of striking.
Yes, the drug problem among the troops in Vietnam, certainly where I was and during the time that I was there, was really rampant. Most of the people in the field that I was with were smoking something, and we tried the best we could to make sure that they were not using drugs when they were going to be pulling a watch at night or something like that. But when I left to fly home, I went through drug screening even as an officer for about 2 days before we could get on the plane to come home. And they were doing that obviously to all of the troops. And the person who was sitting next to me on the plane after we took off was a medical officer. And within a half an hour of our taking off from Vietnam, there were 3 or 4 other troops on the plane who came up to them saying they were hooked on heroin, they needed a fix. And so it was clear that even with all the drug testing that they tried to do to prevent people from leaving who had a drug problem, they were still able to get on the plane, and it was pretty rampant.
Wow. So you get back in the States, and then you're going to ETS out of the service pretty quickly, right?
Yes. My commitment was 2 years as an officer after OCS.
Right.
And as I finished my year as a first lieutenant, my second year as an officer, I was able to process out of the Army, which I was wanting to do to go back to law school. So when I got to Fort Lewis, Washington for processing out, they told us that we couldn't see our families and we couldn't leave the base. It would probably be several weeks before they could process us through. But if we were willing to sign a release that we had no medical problems as a result of being in the Army, that we could leave. So you can imagine what choice we had in that one. We made the choice to sign whatever it was so we could get out and see our families. The other thing that happened was that within a week of getting home to my family, who at that point was living back east in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I was so alienated from them and so suffering, I guess, from post-traumatic stress disorder that another fella and I who had been with me in OCS and who had gone over to Vietnam the same day I did and came back the same day, we decided we were just going to get in a car and drive, and we went out to San Francisco and just tried to get through the summer, just trying to decompress, get over what we'd just been through. There was no any treatment or counseling or anything that the Army had given us when we got back, and we were feeling very, very much alienated from our society and from our families and everybody else who had spent the year that we had been there trying to survive back in the United States, ignoring the fact that the war was happening.
And then you got no treatment later or anything from the service?
No. I think I suffered in different ways over the next 5+ years from what I was feeling, but over time it got less and less, and I began to feel more and more normal as time went by.
So you go back to law school and finish?
I went to law school and started my second year, and I have to say that my heart is with Columbia, because when I told them I was getting out of the Army and I had been wanted to come back to law school that fall, they of course didn't have a place for me because they had filled all the places in my class. But they said, you come back, you're a veteran, you can come back.
Oh.
So I was able to start, and my class in law school, which my graduation class, was 100 people more than the normal class at Columbia Law School, because they had about 100 of us returning veterans that they had taken back.
That's a big group.
Yeah. So you add another third onto the size of the class for the returning veterans, and you could tell us around the campus, because we're the guys that were wearing our fatigue jackets and our boots and stuff like that, because that was the cheapest stuff we had.
Sure. You did some work once you graduated. You did some pro bono work for veterans?
Yes. After I started practicing law in San Francisco, I worked for what was then called Swords to Plowshares. There's still that organization that does different types of things, but what I did for them was I represented Vietnam veterans who had been given either dishonorable or general discharges instead of honorable discharges because of their drug use. And what I was trying to do for them was, there was a process set up where you could have a hearing to show that rather than having been disciplined for drugs, what the Army at that time was doing, because they had to treat people who had a drug problem, was they just simply said you were AWOL or something like that, and so they could discipline them that way and give them less than honorable discharges. So I represented a whole bunch of them, and most of them that I was able to get them an upgrade to their discharge as a result, because we were able to show that the Army had not done what it needed to do, which was to treat the people with drug problems rather than just process them out.
Well, you were sort of in the advanced movement there, because now the VA actually tries to do that within house, so it's nice that that happens. One thing we didn't mention was the fact that you participated in some anti-war demonstrations while you were still in law school, or?
Yes, while I was in my second and third year of law school after getting back from Vietnam, I joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and with Columbia being in New York City, there were some major demonstrations during those 2 years against the war. It was still going on. I mean, it was unbelievable to me that 4 years after Nixon had said he was going to run on the campaign promise that he would end the war in Vietnam with a secret plan to end the war, we were still bombing Haiphong.
Right.
But we were. He was a man of his word, as everybody knows. And so I participated in a number of demonstrations, marching down Broadway with other Vietnam veterans in our jungle fatigues and carrying banners to end the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at least one way to express how much I felt that the war had been a mistake, and how a lot of us had had our lives totally disrupted, and a lot of people didn't come back for a mistake.
Well, Norm, I'd like to thank you for, first of all, for your service, but also for coming in today and telling
Sure.
your story. I really appreciate it, so welcome home.
Thank you.
That concludes our time on Valley to Vietnam. I'd like to thank Norm for his time today and say welcome home. And to all our veterans, for producer Jerry Ward and director James Scott, I'm Bob Tribe, and we'll see you next time.